All right, so this is going to be my tight end rankings at the end of the NFL season. So again, I'll preface this if you haven't watched my other videos. This is strictly based off of this season. I don't care about any previous accolades or anything. It's going to be strictly statistical, right? I don't care if you had a bad quarterback and you could have been a better tight end if you had a better quarterback. I don't care about that because those are pretty much impossible to confirm. So it's going to be how you performed statistically this season only. Playoffs do play a factor, but let's get started. Starting off with some honorable mentions, I will have 50 names and then 10 honorable mentions here, being Elijah Higgins, Nate Adkins, Darnell Washington, Cade Stover, Payne Durham, Lucas Kroll, Wiley Cox, Brock Wright, Michael Meyer, and Stone Smart. And then starting off at number 50 is going to be Nick Vannett. I know a lot of you guys probably don't care about some of these names. I don't really care about some of these names, so I'm going to not really talk too much about some of these guys, but the stats are here if you really want to look at them yourself. I'm going to talk about some of it and just kind of keep this moving on. He only averaged 8 yards per game and had 3 touchdowns in 17 games, which was pretty solid. Eric All, I think All or Ali, I don't know. 18 yards per game, 158 yards there in 9 games is decent, I suppose. Next up is Johnny Munt. He had 8 yards per game and 2 touchdowns in his 17 games this season. Devin Culp for the Bucks, 18 yards per game, nearly 18 yards per reception, which was first in the league this year. He only had 5 total receptions all season long, so take that into account. But he was pretty good, I suppose, in the few games he did play. Number 46, Adam Trotman, 11 yards per game, 14.5 yards per reception, which is pretty good. And he actually had, 13 catches all year, so it's a little better than Devin Culp. Second in yards per reception, though, and 2 touchdowns this year. Luke Schoonmaker at 45, 14 yards per game, 240 yards and 1 touchdown in 17 games. Next up is Josh Wiley at 44, 15 yards per game, 250 yards and 1 touchdown in 17 games. We got Tanner Hudson at 43, 14 yards per game, 150 yards and 1 touchdown in 11 games. He also had 1 lost fumble, which does not help him. 42, Grant Calcaterra for Philadelphia, 18 yards per game, was 8th in yards per reception at 12.4 on a decent amount of receptions, 300 yards and 1 touchdown. Good backup tight end for them. 41 is Colby Parkinson. So he was kind of RB1 in LA for a few weeks before Tyler Higbee, was playing for them, but he didn't really do a whole lot for them. 17 yards per game, 300 yards and 1 touchdown in 17 games. Next up is Jake Ferguson, a good tight end here, solid tight end here for the Cowboys. 50 yards a game almost, 500 yards, but 0 touchdowns and 4 fumbles. Not a good look. Next up is Tavion Sanders for the Panthers. He was pretty good. 21 yards a game, 340 yards, and a touchdown in 16 games. Then you got Dawson Knox at 38. I had him at 26. He kind of underperformed there quite a bit, but still 19 yards per game, 300 yards, and 1 touchdown, with tied for 4th in yards per reception at 14.1. 37 is Tommy Tremble, 20 yards a game, 230 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Also had a lost fumble, though, which does not help him. 36 is A.J. Barner for Seattle. 14 yards a game, 245 yards, and 4 touchdowns is pretty solid there for him. 35 is Josh Oliver, 17 yards per game, 258 yards, and 3 receiving touchdowns in 15 games. 34, Jordan Akins. A good backup tight end, certainly for Cleveland. 23 yards per game, 400 yards almost, and 2 touchdowns in 17 games. Did have a lost fumble there, which again does not help anything. 33, Brenton Strange. So Evan Ingram missed a good amount of time, and Brenton Strange was solid in his absence. 24 yards a game, 400 yards, and 2 touchdowns. 32 is Chigo Okonkwo. Not even going to try to pronounce that first name. 29 yards per game, nearly 500 yards, and 2 touchdowns, but also had 2 lost fumbles, which is not a good look for him. Next up is Theo Johnson for the Giants. He was solid. 27 yards per game, 330 yards, and 1 touchdown in 12 games played. Number 30 is Austin Hooper for the Patriots. 28 yards per game, 475 yards, 3 touchdowns, but those 2 lost fumbles definitely hurt him quite a bit. 29, Will Dissly for the Chargers. Good for them. 32 yards a game, 480 yards, and 2 touchdowns in 15 games. 28 Noah Fant for Seattle. Had him at 30, or had him at 25. Falls down a couple spots at 28. 36 yards per game. 500 yards. Only one touchdown though. We'd like to get that up a little bit. 27 Dalton Kincaid. Had him at 9. He had a great year last year, but he just kind of took a step down this year. They did have quite a bit of receivers that did a lot of good work, so you can't be too mad at him for that. But 35 yards a game, 450 yards, and 2 touchdowns, and only 13 games played. Number 26, Tyler Conklin was pretty good here with Aaron Rodgers and the Jets. 28 yards a game, 450 yards, and 4 touchdowns. 25, Foster Moreau for the Saints. Had him at 47. He outperformed that by quite a bit. 24 yards per game, 400 yards, and 5 touchdowns, which is tied for 9th, in a 4-way tie for 9th, but still pretty good. Obviously, that is among tight ends. And 6th in yards per reception among tight ends as well with 12.9. 24 is Dewan Johnson, 32 yards a game, 550 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Only 3 touchdowns isn't a whole lot, and 2 lost fumbles don't help him, but I think he was slightly better than his teammate, Foster Moreau. 23, Evan Ingram, so I had him at number 6. He was injured, a little bit disappointing this year, but still a great, a solid year nonetheless. 41 yards, 41 yards a game, 370 yards, only 1 touchdown though in 9 games played. 22 is Dalton Schultz for the Texans, 31 yards a game, 530 yards, and 2 touchdowns in 17 games played. Kind of disappointing. You know, he had a lot more than that last year, but only 2 touchdowns isn't great, but still certainly solid for him. 21, Noah Gray, 25 yards a game, 440 yards, and 5 touchdowns. So more touchdowns than his teammate Travis Kelce, which is certainly worth noting. Tied for 9th in that field. Really good backup tight end for Kansas City. Number 20, Mike Gesicki for Cincinnati, 39 yards a game, 65 receptions, which is tied for 8th, and 10th in yards at 665, but only 2 touchdowns to 1 fumble, and not a great look there. Number 19, Cole Kmet for the Bears, 28 yards a game, 474 yards, and 4 touchdowns. Really solid tight end there. Sorry, I need a drink. All right. 18 is Hunter Henry, 42 yards a game, tied for 6th in reception and 8th in receiving yards, with 2 touchdowns there in 16 games. Number 17, Tyler Higbee. He was injured quite a bit, only played a couple of games. Also played in the playoffs though, and was good in that game. So that's a lot of where this comes from. 22 yards per game. He did have 2 touchdowns in 3 games though, which is fine. And he had a good playoff game as well. Number 16 is T.J. Hawkinson. He was also injured quite a bit, so he does fall off quite a bit. 5 down to 16. He was 8th in yards at 45, which is good. 455 yards a game. 0 touchdowns though in 10 games played is a big surprise because he usually gets a good amount of touchdowns, but this year not the case. Number 15, Kyle Pitts. I have number 5, which again, in hindsight, you can never really bet on Kyle Pitts to be a great tight end. He was still a good tight end this year with Kirk Cousins. 35 yards a game, 600 yards and 4 touchdowns is solid, and 7th in yards per reception at 12.8. Number 14 is Cade Otton, 42 yards a game, 10th in the league. 600 yards and 4 receptions is good. Those 2 lost fumbles probably are what make the difference between him not being a top 10 tight end. Number 13, Pat Freiermuth for the Steelers. He was great. 38 yards per game, 653 yards, 7 touchdowns, tied for 4th in a 4-way tie for 4th, but still, and also tied for 8th at receptions. But he did have 3 lost fumbles, which again are probably the difference maker for him not being a top 10 tight end. Number 12 is Dallas Goedert, almost 50 yards per game, which is 6th in the league, 500 yards and 2 touchdowns in 10 games played, but also those 2 lost fumbles, again, are probably the reason why he's not a top 10 tight end. Number 11, Tucker Kraft, he was an honorable mention coming in, so he certainly shot up those rankings quite a bit. 42 yards a game, 700 yards, 7th in the league, in a 4-way tie for 4th with 7 total touchdowns, and he did only 1 lost fumble, which isn't bad. 4th in the league as well in yards per reception among tight ends at 14.1. Number 10 is going to be Travis Kelce. He had a bad year this year comparatively. Again, a lot of people talk about a lot of different players this year saying they had bad years just because they were bad comparatively to their years they've had before. It's because somebody's been top 3, top 2, top 1 at their position in the last 5 years and has not a top 3, top 2, top 1 year. Doesn't mean they had a bad year, right? Travis Kelce still had a good year. 5th in yards per game, 3rd in receptions, 5th in total yards, right? In only 16 games played. 3 touchdowns and 2 fumbles, not a great look, but those other stats are really, really good. So still a top 10 season in my opinion. Also had 1 really good playoff game against the Texans. Number 9, Isaiah Likely. He was at number 20 coming in. He coming in at number 9. He's tight end 2 for his team, and he's a top 9 tight end in the league. That's pretty impressive. 30 yards a game, 470 yards, and tied for 8th in touchdowns at 6 touchdowns this year. Number 8, Zach Ertz. He was at number 29 coming in. At the end of last season, a lot of people thought that he might just retire, right? I thought he still had something left in the tank. I thought he was going to come in and be a decent tight end here for Washington, but he actually been a great tight end for them. 39 yards a game, tied for 6th in receptions at 66, 650 yards, tied for 4th with 7 touchdowns. He's been really, really good for Washington Commanders. Number 7 is Stephen Laporta. I had him come in at number 1. He had a great rookie year last year, so I thought he was going to build on that and be the best tight end in football. He didn't really build on that, but he still was great, right? 45 yards a game, 9th in the league, 700 yards, 6th in the league, tied for 4th with 7 touchdowns, 10th in yards per reception at 12.1. He's top 10 in most of these categories. Still a great year, just not an elite tight end season. Number 6, Mark Andrews. He's at number 4 coming in. He did have, pretty famous bad playoff performance, so take that as what you will, but he was still great this year. 40 yards a game, 9th in yards at 670, and 1st in touchdowns at 11 receiving touchdowns. Great year for Mark Andrews. Number 5, David Njoku, so he was great for Cleveland. 7th in yards at 46, 10th in receptions at 64, 500 yards, and tied for 9th at touchdowns with 5 receiving touchdowns this season. Oh, wait, shoot. Also, only 11 games played. He was tied for 9th in touchdowns and top 10 in receptions with only 11 games played. Number 4, Trey McBride. So 2nd in yards per game at about 72, 2nd in receptions at 111, 2nd in yards total at 1146. But only 2 touchdowns to 0 fumbles. I mean, 0 fumbles is obviously good, but only 2 receiving touchdowns is not great. He did have a rushing touchdown, which is cool, but he got to get more touchdowns than that. Number 3, you got Jonnu Smith, which is probably the surprise of the year for me personally, because I had him at number 19, which I feel like was pretty high on him to start the year anyways. He came out and was a top 3 tight end in the league this year. That's crazy to me. 4th in yards per game at 52, 4th in receptions at 88, 4th in yards at 884, tied for 2nd in touchdowns at 8. With 2 lost fumbles isn't great, but those other stats are amazing. Number 2, Brock Bowers. Not the best tight end in his rookie year, but certainly the best rookie tight end of all time. One of the best rookie receivers in general, counting wide receivers obviously, of all time as well. 3rd in yards per game at 71, 1st in receptions at 112, 1st in yards at nearly 1,200, and tied for 9th in touchdowns with 5. At number 1, of course, is going to be George Kittle. 1st in yards per game at 74, 5th in receptions at 78, 3rd in yards total at 1,100, tied for 2nd in touchdowns with 8, and 3rd in yards per reception. And he only played 15 games. If he plays a couple more games, he could be even higher on some of these lists. And then that's going to be it for that. But we got some missing players, quite a bit of missing guys here, because it's kind of hard to determine the tight end 2s for a lot of teams. So I got Durham Smythe, Gerald Everett, Greg Dulcich, Ian Thomas, Kylan Granson, Jared Wiley, Jeremy Ruckert, Luke Musgrave, Mercedes Lewis, Taysom Hill, who's an RB in my rankings, Pharaoh Brown, Ben Sinnott, Brevin Jordan, Connor Hayward, Daniel Bellinger, and Drew Samples. A lot of guys there. I do have my simple view for you guys if you just want to look at it again, kind of take a picture of it, if whatever you want to do to remember this, right? This is a very simple view to look at, and that's going to be it for this video. Thank you for watching. Make sure to check back. I still have another video coming out this week. And make sure to check out my previous videos this week if you have not already.